Today is the 100-year anniversary of Mr. Thomas Kane, who, quote, probably did more to promote the tithe than any other man. If you have ever heard anything about tithing or heard anyone preach about this, it is mostly due to the influence of this man. Christianity Today wrote that the modern Christian emphasis on tithing stemmed largely from the efforts of Chicago businessman Thomas Kane. His influence was so great that one author said tithing properly considered in United States history must be dated to a large extent in terms BK and AK, before Kane and after Kane. In 1916, one magazine wrote, "Every human being must have hobbies, and Mr. Thomas Kane has three: tithing, fishing, and golf. It is hard to tell whether fishing or tithing has the preference." That's funny. He has been the advocate of tithing for 40 years or more and has sent out millions of tracts and articles urging all to follow the scriptural injunction and give 1/10 to the Lord. Born in 1837 in Adams County, Ohio, Thomas Kane would later become a very successful and wealthy businessman in Chicago. According to the 1911 Book of Chicagoans, a biographical dictionary of leading men of the city, Kane moved to Chicago in 1872 and in 1875 began manufacturing school furniture under the style of Thomas Kane and Company, later incorporated. His company also manufactured electro-vapor engines and high-grade pleasure boats, sailboats, canoes, etc. At the time of his death in 1924, he was rated as a millionaire. Now remember that this was in the 1920s, when being a millionaire meant that you were very wealthy. Now, the story of how Kane got involved in tithing is very interesting. In his autobiography, Kane said that in the year 1870, I commenced tithing my income. The reasons were distinctly not altruistic. I confess that self-defense was a more prominent reason than duty. Like many other people, I was an emotional giver, was too much governed by impulse rather than reason. To some objects, I gave more than I should, and to others less. I needed a rule, a limit, and so my wife and I adopted the 10th as a convenient rule. And besides, we had Bible authority for it. Neither of us regarded the tithe as a permanently binding law of the race. Indeed, so far as I know, neither of us had ever heard a sermon or read a book on the subject. Noticing that each year from 1870 to 1876, his profits increased with greater ratio, this deepened the conviction that there was a very close affiliation between tithing and temporal prosperity. I felt that if this was true in my own case, as it certainly appeared to be, it might be true of others, and that if the facts could be obtained and widely published, the one paramount objection to tithing as a rule of life might in a large measure be overcome. Interestingly, up to 1876, and so far as I can recall for several years thereafter, I did not know another tither, so that I had no personal means of verifying my opinion regarding the cause and effect relations between tithing and temporal prosperity. Having an extensive acquaintance among ministers, I felt that if there were any tithers, they of all men ought to know it. Hence I asked, as opportunity offered, and where opportunities did not offer, I made them, all the ministers of my acquaintance if they knew any tithers, and if so, how their temporal prosperity compared with others who did not tithe. So far as I remember, none of them personally knew a tither. So this is very interesting. When Thomas Kane started tithing, he had never heard a sermon or read a book on the subject and had never known another tither. And the ministers acquainted with Kane did not themselves know of any tithers. Now, this would make some sense because this is the late 19th century in America. The subject of tithing has a very long history in Europe because, unfortunately, it came to the point where the church and state were united, and the state would enforce and compel tithing in order to support the state church. But when this brand new country of the USA began, that all stopped. The American concept of separation of church and state brought an end to state-enforced tithing. This history and subsequent stewardship awakening are beyond the scope of this video, so it does make sense that tithing was not widely known and that Kane in the late 19th century had never heard about this. Believing that this phase of the subject is of paramount importance, especially to laymen, I determined to make all possible inquiry by correspondence and to obtain all the facts available. Kane wrote his first pamphlet on tithing in 1876, which included the question, "It is my personal belief that God prospers in temporal affairs those who honor him by setting apart a definite proportion of their income to his service. I have never known an exception, have you? Please give me any facts within your personal knowledge on this subject. Especially give the facts if you know of any exceptions." From the years 1877 and 1878, this pamphlet was sent to probably 3/4 of all the ministers in the principal evangelical denominations in the northern states and to a larger number in the South. Kane received at least 200 to 300 positive replies. The testimony was practically uniform that temporal prosperity follows tithing. No exceptions worthy of the name were given. I could not but feel that if these testimonials could be widely distributed and read by laymen, the result would be not only a real awakening on the subject of tithing, but a large increase in contributions to Christian benevolences. So Kane learns about tithing all by himself. This is through self-discovery. He begins to practice it and has the conviction that doing so has led to prosperity. Out of curiosity, he sends out a survey to churches across the nation and finds out that other people are having similar experiences. So the results of this survey prove a very important point. Although there had been a growing interest in the topic of stewardship, the practice of tithing was largely an unknown and untaught subject in the 19th century USA. Despite this, there were still many people scattered throughout the country who, whether by conviction, self-study, or desire to make giving more systematic, had been practicing tithing and did so long enough to observe some positive correlation between tithing and temporal prosperity. The feedback received is very interesting and fascinating because it was not 80-20 or 70-30 or 50-50, but almost 100% in support that tithing and prosperity are linked. This finding lit a fire in Thomas Kane, and so, at his own expense, he began publishing and circulating promotional pamphlets and booklets. In the next 10 years, Mr. Kane sent out more than 5 million tract pamphlets on this subject, almost always published under the pseudonym of Layman. In fact, as you can see here, when he was buried, Layman is inscribed on the headstone. Now, this immense amount of tithing literature is remarkable considering that the population of the USA during this time was about 50 to 60 million people. Today, we use the term viral when some article or video is seen by millions of people. So Kane was in his time making the message of tithe go viral, if you will. Around the turn of the century, from about 1890 to about 1915, tithing became a very popular topic. Quote, "With few exceptions, the religious press has not only ceased to be apathetic, but is becoming one of the most active and influential agencies in favor of tithing." Kane's pamphlets were initially free, but by 1890, demand was so big that Kane had to begin requesting payment for the cost of printing. By 1900, no more free pamphlets to anyone. It was too expensive in cost and labor. In 1918, Kane observed that there are now any number of agencies circulating tithing literature. Scores, yes, hundreds of books, pamphlets, and addresses on tithing are being written and published. The subject is made prominent at almost every religious convention. Conferences, associations, presbyteries, etc. are adopting resolutions in favor of tithing. Several denominations have tithing and stewardship secretaries. George Brown, also an advocate of tithing, wrote, "The demand for literature on the subject became so great that the 20th Century Tithe Covenant Association was organized at the Winona Bible Conference in 1904 with Thomas Kane as president." And here we need to make mention of another big influence on tithing, and that is Dr. Henry Lansdell of England. Here's a picture of him with his amazing mustache. This man was ordained as a priest in the Church of England, and if you search his name online, you'll find some really cool pictures of him because at the time that Thomas Kane is getting fired up about tithing, Dr. Lansdell is exploring throughout Siberia and traveling on a yak through Central Asia, region of China and Russia, where he distributes Bibles and religious literature. He writes several books about his travels and experiences, and after extensive research, he publishes in 1906 the 2-volume work on the history of tithing titled The Sacred Tenth, which is available to read for free online. This is arguably one of the most influential books ever published on tithing. Dr. Croteau said that Dr. Lansdell advocated tithing from a more scholarly basis. Lansdell's work was a landmark in tithing research because not only was it the culmination of the previous 3 decades of research, but it became paradigmatic for tithing arguments and discussions over the next 99 years. So where Kane was a promoter whose pamphlets tended to emphasize the beneficial experience of tithing, Dr. Lansdell was a scholar with a wealth of tithe research going back thousands of years to the ancient empires of Assyria and Babylon, etc. Kane, of course, saw this, and so he ordered hundreds of copies of Lansdell's work and sent them to seminaries and their libraries. And this is really helpful because it provided religious leaders with extensive research and evidence. These 2 men, Lansdell and Kane, had previously corresponded, and then they met each other at the 1904 Tithing Conference. In England, the one who perhaps more than any other person has done most to promote tithe paying is the Reverend Henry Lansdell. So we have Kane in America and Lansdell in England. Around 1917, Kane formed the Layman Company, later renamed to Layman Tithing Foundation, a non-profit with a board of directors with representatives from nearly all the leading denominations. A Presbyterian, Kane continually promoted tithing among all denominations, and his America Tithers Union is rapidly becoming what was intended a kind of tithing clearinghouse for all denominations. Directors stressed that the foundation was non-denominational and cooperates with all denominations. Being a very wealthy millionaire, Kane set aside a considerable sum to ensure continuance of this work after his death. By 1956, the Layman Tithing Foundation was still sending out 2 million pamphlets a year and giving out awards to people who promoted tithing. So, to those of you watching this video, you might be asking the question, what happened to this foundation? In the year 2006, the Tithing Foundation Board donated the foundation and all of its assets to the Lutheran School of Theology at Chicago, or LSTC, with the understanding that LSTC would continue to keep alive the goal of stewardship and tithing education, information, and practices. Since then, LSTC has been updating the foundation's publications and resources and developing workshops. However, there is some concern about this because this is a non-profit, so it's required by the IRS to make its financial records available to the public, which document that LSTC has received around $20,000 to $30,000 every year. And as you can see here, it explicitly states the purpose of the grant is support for distribution of tithing literature and holding of stewardship seminars for education of pastors and churches. So if you count up all the money LSTC has received, at least over $330,000 in grants from the Thomas Kane Trust to promote tithing, and just a few months ago filed that they received another $29,000. However, the problem and concern is that it appears that they do not do anything to promote tithing. Now, to those of you watching this video, whether you are a Christian or not, whether or not you support tithing, that is beside the point. Here is a man who used his own money to set up this ministry to promote this after his death. And now the sad irony is that the church seminary that has accepted the mission of this foundation is taking all the money and is apparently doing nothing to further that stated mission. The Tithing Foundation previously had its own website, but after lack of maintenance expired, which begs the question, how is it possible to receive over $360,000 and you can't even maintain a simple website? That doesn't make any sense. I personally went to Chicago to visit the Lutheran School of Theology, and when I asked about this, nobody was available to provide answers. So I followed up with several emails and letters asking about this, but several months later have still received no answers. I personally sent a detailed, documented, very nice report of Thomas Kane and the history of this foundation to the president of this seminary, and I received a response that he was busy traveling, but after several months, again, still no answer. Thomas Kane died exactly 100 years ago on September 26, 1924, at the age of 87. He was buried in a family plot at Oakwoods Cemetery on the south side of Chicago. In September of last year, I personally visited Kane's burial site, and unfortunately, it appears that nobody has visited this site for decades. Kane's headstone had fallen over, and the headstones of his children have fallen over and sunk in the ground for so many decades that the names are covered by the ground.
Here is the grave site of the Thomas Kane family. You can see the headstone for Thomas Kane, layman, 1837 to 1924. And then his wife, and then it looks like some family members, but unfortunately their headstones have fallen over and they are sunk in the ground. So you can't even see the names, which is unfortunate. So this is where the Kane family is buried, at the Oakwood Cemetery in Chicago, Illinois. The man responsible for the promotion of tithing, Mr. Thomas Kane, aka the layman. Dirty! Now Thomas Kane's headstone is upright. Great. Okay, very good. Now, after what looks like several decades of sinking there in the dirt, Thomas Kane's headstone is now upright. Very good. So underneath the headstone, there's a piece of rock under here. You can tell it's flat where this was originally set, and somehow it got knocked over. Also this one, that's fixed.
One author observed, "This man has caused rivers of gold to flow into church treasuries and mission fields where before only drops were noticed. Thomas Kane has sent showers of blessing into thousands of congregations and homes and into perhaps millions of individual lives through his stewardship and tithing literature. It generally is acknowledged that the cause of Christian stewardship in America owes more to the life and work of Thomas Kane than to that of any other one man of modern times." So take a moment to stop and appreciate that. Multiplied hundreds of thousands of churches, organizations, pastors, evangelists, missionaries, etc., for over a century have benefited from the love and devotion of this man to this cause, and yet his grave is ignored and in disrepair. What is really sad is that the church seminary that receives hundreds of thousands of dollars from his foundation is literally just 3 miles just down the street from his burial place. I specifically contacted the seminary leadership and I told them about this history, about the gravesite being in disrepair. And I told them that the 100-year anniversary would be later this year and would be a great, wonderful opportunity to honor his memory, and yet no response. Anyways, as for the man himself, he was described as very active and in perennial youth. Mr. Kane has never lived in the past, but in the future. He has a fine sense of humor and a fine sense of honor. And this here is funny. The writer is personally acquainted with Mr. Kane and can testify that he who has harped on the one-string tithing for over 40 years has not soured, but is the sunniest, kindliest of men with a wide range of interests. So the man who most promoted and kept harping on tithing was described as energetic, earnest, youthful, honorable, kind, sunny, and humorous. Every description is that this was a really cool dude. Kane and his wife had 6 children, but 5 of them died very young from diphtheria, but another report says scarlet fever. Their only surviving child was their daughter Theodosia, who married Mr. Merle Eschbau, but unfortunately they had no children, so there are no known descendants of Thomas Kane. Spiritual descendants? Yes, including me. Physical descendants? No. Kane wrote, I have for 37 years been seeking for facts as to the results of tithing. The many millions of questions sent out and the many thousands of answers received prove beyond question that tithing pays. Pays financially, pays spiritually, pays in personal happiness, pays in the comfort and happiness of other people. In short, pays in every good sense. Also, the dominant note in all testimonials from tithers is the joy of giving. My friends, today is September 26, 2024, the 100-year anniversary of his death. Rest in peace, Thomas Kane.